Several of the panelists for this panel unfortunately had either personal or professional circumstances that made it impossible for them to be with us today, and so we're very thankful, first of all, for Zainab Udeli, who's a former communications officer for Syrians for Justice and Truth, to come out and be with us on a relatively short notice. We had originally thought of Eric Wilbach to introduce as a moderator for this panel, but Eric himself is an internationally recognized expert, both as a scholar and as an advisor practitioner on transitional justice. I asked him again at the last minute to pivot his role from moderator to panelist, and so I'm very happy to introduce our brand new colleague here at Kickoff. Brand new, maybe it's a stretch, but brand new to me anyway. I mean, it seems like he just got here, but Eric Wiebelhaus-Bram, who has joined us here at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention as a professor of genocide and mass atrocity prevention, and so we're very delighted to have both of you with us. So there's a bit of a backgrounder on your programs on page 10, but let me just say a few opening words to sort of set the stage and pose the, some opening questions to our panelists. We're all presumably familiar with the idea of transitional justice, which is the suite of programs, initiatives, and measures that usually governments can and should undertake to deal with the various complex legacies of a proximate and sometimes a not so proximate past of atrocity violence. And one of the things that is, I think, is quite important for us at IGMAP, because there's a great deal of expertise in the faculty of IGMAP on transitional justice, particularly in things like the design and assessment of truth commissions, or how truth commissions operate, how their recommendations are or are not operationalized, and so on. One of the things that we at IGMAP, as a prevention-based institute, spend a lot of time thinking about is this. It's oversimplified, but this duality of transitional justice, which is backward-looking and forward-looking at one and the same time. Backward-looking in the sense of what justice is owed to victims in terms of some of the primary needs that victims and survivors of mass political violence experience: the need for reparations, the need for identifying the whereabouts, the fate, and the remains of their loved ones. Becomes across radically different national and cultural contexts, becomes, as you can imagine, a fundamental need and a fundamental demand that any transitional justice approach needs to take. The need for truth, the right to have an objective, factually accurate, and exhaustive account of the empirical details of the experience, the national experience of extreme violence. And then accountability. What kind of measures are we talking about this yesterday in terms of the Colombian context? What do we owe the victims? I mean, the perpetrators. In what sense do the perpetrators also have something that is owed to them in terms of restorative justice or criminal legal procedures or what have you? So transitional justice is, I think, in a very important sense, backward-looking. I mean, it's not, we can't, I mean, to put it in a very sort of cliche way, it's virtually impossible. We know this from too many frustrating experiences. It's virtually impossible to start afresh in the wake of extreme violence with the idea that the past is behind us, we can ignore it, because we can try to ignore it, but it doesn't ignore us. At the same time, we at IGMAP really theorize or think about transitional justice as redressive measures that are atrocity prevention measures, which is to say they're forward-looking attempts to identify and reduce the risk of known drivers of the recurrence of atrocity violence. We know, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about this more with Holly later in the afternoon, we know that controlling for all other factors, approximate history of atrocity violence is the strongest predictor of atrocity violence. So again, justice is good, justice is very good, but justice without a thought to how these mechanisms can be used and used effectively and used affordably in ways that identifiably and effectively reduce the risk of recurrence is the primary challenge, I think, or a primary challenge in transitional justice. And I think nowhere can this be more clear than in the context of Syria. As you know, Syria is the brutal Assad regime that brutalized citizens beginning in 2011, prior to that, but especially in the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, fell rather abruptly and unexpectedly. And the new interim government of Syria has made extensive and substantial commitments to transitional justice, including things like a national commission of inquiry, what we would call Truth Commission, a national commission for missing persons, a national dialogue on the outstanding issues that face the country. All of this being said, in 2025, all this being said, there is widespread, and as we'll explore, widespread concern about some of the durability and to be frankly, the sincerity and authenticity of many of the interim government's transitional justice measures. Because if you study transitional justice at all, you know that one of the things that we always worry about with transitional justice is box ticking. An expressive sort of course we'll have a truth commission, of course we'll go after the perpetrators, of course we'll have reparations, when in fact this is more expressive and performative than it is substantive. There are deep concerns about whether or not the Syrian experiment in transitional justice will be in a position to draw on a whole range of best practices and of resources that have developed over the course of near approaching 50 years of experiments in transitional justice. There are external actors who are standing in the way. Israel comes to mind certainly as a country that, for reasons of its own, seems deeply interested in subverting and minimizing the chances for any transitional justice effort. But as you know, as we'll talk about, there are multiple reasons for concern, and so that's why I'm so glad that we do have the panelists we have and who have made it here. I'm going to start off with you, Zainab, and maybe just again, just to start us off, who are you? Why are you here? Tell us a little bit about your work, and maybe just to start us off, just the 10,000 meter view at first, before we dive into some of the actual details. There's a very well populated cast of characters here, operating in very, very complicated ways. We can't unravel the whole thing in 90 minutes, but maybe you can just start us off by giving us your 30,000 foot overview of what we should be looking at and what we should be feeling cautiously optimistic about and what we should be worried about.
Yeah, thank you everyone for having me today. I do think it is important to raise the fact that the executive director of Syrians for Truth and Justice, Bassam al-Ahmed, had been originally invited to be here. And part of the reason primarily the reason he can't be here is because he is a Syrian national, and under the Trump ban, he was not allowed to enter the country. So I think there is some element to that the reason why I happen to be able to be sitting here is because I am Syrian American and I am an American citizen. And so I'm able to kind of join in these conversations when a lot of other Syrians who are in diaspora, either living in Europe or in Turkey or in Syria, are unable to kind of join conversations here stateside. So I did want to kind of put a pin on that. In terms of Syrians for Truth and Justice, for those of you who might not be familiar with the organization, it was developed kind of as an idea, and Bassam said in 2015, as an idea to be able to talk about the experiences of Syrians who had experienced detention and torture within prisons and in different arenas. Over time in 2016, it kind of developed into a human rights monitor where we have networks of field researchers on the ground in Syria And they used to be able to document violations, and then we bring them out to kind of teams who are in diaspora, who are either living in Europe or in the United States, who kind of take these kind of violations that we've recorded, we collect them in a database, and then we use them to kind of report on violations. And that has kind of been the pattern that we've used over the years. And during my time at Syrians for Truth and Justice, I was a communications officer. I have to admit, like when you're asking about, you know, what's the 30,000-foot view, I think I must be feeling relatively optimistic given the fact that I'm sitting here in front of you using my full name, considering during my time at Syrians for Truth and Justice, I worked entirely anonymously. Most of the team was anonymous. We actually referred to each other by pseudonyms because there was a serious safety concern, whether or not you were ever going to be able to return to Syria if you ever did work on Syria. And for many of us who had family that was in Syria, there was a lot of a culture of strong fear that the government would potentially go after family members who were in Syria if it was found out that you had been doing this kind of work. So in terms of the kind of broad overview, I mean, I think I can do kind of the general kind of 3 points that I think, at least from Syrians for Truth and Justice, is like what our perspective is, which is we're optimistic about the fact that it seems that the interim government is willing to work. The fact that during the violations this past year, they've opened up for the Commission of Inquiry to be able to come in and kind of do some assessments on violations. This hasn't happened in Syria since 2011, so that seems like a good metric. It feels like there's something that can be working, you know, in that sense. But at the same time, kind of two of our kind of primary concerns, which I'm sure we'll kind of continue to discuss over the course of this conversation, is there is a concern that a lot of power is being concentrated within the executive. And so there's fears about whether or not that, as much as people are saying that, oh, it's only for this 5-year period, there is fear that that concentration of power is going to develop into more of the same in the future, and we might not be able to kind of pull away from that. And there's also fears that even though there are steps being taken towards transitional justice, that potentially that might be asymmetric, because it seems like a lot of the concentration for, like you mentioned, there is now this National Commission for Transitional Justice that had been founded and announced in May 2025. That one specifically says that they're going to be looking at violations that were committed by the former government, and they don't mention the other actors or violators that are happening. And so there's some fear that if this process isn't comprehensive, you're going to end up creating this culture of impunity where there are a lot of other violators who are on the ground who might not be held accountable, or most importantly, there are going to be a lot of victims who are kind of excluded out of this transitional justice process. But I don't know if Layla, you wanted to give like the broad overview.
Let me follow up and maybe we can get Layla and Alana to join us in the conversation. Yes.
Let me get very specific. I mean, one of the things, and again, you see what I'm doing here. I'm going specifically to the Syrian context, and Eric will be doing the same, I hope, and sort of comparing notes with kinds of comparable, never identical, but comparable problems that have been encountered in other national contexts. I mean, transitions are tough. Transitions are very tough, and they're often very violent, especially when you have a country that has had really polarized, fragmented group divisions that have been, in some sense, papered over by an authoritarian dictatorship, and in other senses, sort of preserved and protected. So I'm thinking specifically of some really, really serious recurring violence in Sueda. And the point I'm going to make is just because the transition has happened doesn't mean the violence stops. So there was severe clashes between interim government forces and Druze groups in Sueda over this past summer. A lot of people, a lot of civilians ended up getting massacred, presumably by government forces. That the violence flared up again last month. Israel has been, as they have always been here, a bad actor in spinning a legend that they are actually firing missiles into Syria to protect the Druze minority, which is risible. So there's an international conflict component here, but there's also a fact that the interim government itself is massacring Syrian citizens. And the question is there any provision, is there any prospect in the ongoing work in progress transitional justice approach to hold them accountable for these kinds of crimes? Is that going to be handled by the normal Syrian criminal justice or military justice system, or is that itself a transitional justice problem?
I mean, I can just say, in terms of one of the major problems that we have in Syria is that we have a court system that over the years of war and even before under the Assad regime was not only ineffective at being able to prevent violations, it was also complicit. So you're talking about court systems, especially like the terrorism courts, that ended up putting people in jail. So there's very little faith in terms of the court system. So one of the primary problems is you have to kind of build up a kind of rule of law system. Now, when it comes to when you're talking about the violations that happened on the coast and in Sueda, part of the concerns, and this is what I was mentioning when we're talking about asymmetric justice, you know, people on the ground have experienced violations at the hands of multiple different actors. And those include members of what used to be called the Syrian National Army, which has been funded, you know, partly by Turkey, and current kind of findings that we have found in our reporting, and that was later verified by the Commission of Inquiry's investigations on the coastal violence, is that there are certain brigades that we had specifically mentioned that were responsible for violations in the past. So specifically at Hamza, Sultan Suleiman Shah, those factions were basically integrated into the general security forces, which now kind of represent the standing army of the government, but they weren't fully integrated. So you basically have these factions that kind of fell into the army, and it seems like they have very little civilian oversight. And so we know that they had been responsible for violations that happened on the coast. And then later when the violence began in Sueda, it seems that there are other factions there was a very similar pattern where you have these factions who ended up committing violations. And the Commission of Inquiry report essentially found that even though orders didn't come from the interim government, there's been no findings that it was the policy of the interim government to be able to say, okay, we're going to be committing these massacres against the civilians. But it was a finding of a Commission of Inquiry report that in both cases, that it seemed to have been the policy of a subset of commanders that were within these kind of factional forces. So when we're saying about asymmetry and accountability, when the transitional process begins, if we're not going to be addressing the violations that these armed factions had committed over the last decade, it's kind of unsurprising that you're going to then see them committing very similar violations today that they did 5-6 years ago. And so I think this is what we mean when we're saying that there has to be a transitional justice process to be able to hold factions, former government, everyone who committed violations against civilians needs to be held to account during this process. But then also in this moment, there needs to be a feeling that the current interim government is going to be holding its own forces accountable for violations that have taken place. Now, they have said that they have made several arrests. So many of these people who committed the violations, both on the coast and in Sueda, ultimately filmed themselves committing violations. So what we know is that there have been certain arrests that have taken place of people who filmed themselves or who are seen in videos committing violations. But we've not seen any evidence that certain commanders are being held to account. You know, if this is going to be a recurring pattern, that if there are people who are in charge for whom this is a policy, we haven't seen investigations on that. Notably, they haven't released the interim government said that they were going to be doing kind of an inquiry into what happened in Sueda. They haven't published their full findings. So I think we're gonna have to see what happens and what they're saying. So that's kind of where it stands on that front. I don't know if Layla, you wanna?
I want to thank Gina for this session and just recognize Max for the effort he made and Harry for trying to bring together a robust Syrian panel. And we're all very disappointed that you don't have the on-the-ground expertise that was intended for this panel. And I apologize for being late. This is like something I'm doing in my midlife, and I apologize. I thought we started at 9:30. So So thank you and apologies. I want to step back a little bit to answer the question of how do you hold the current authorities accountable for ongoing violations, and look at sort of the way in which they came to power. At the time in December 2024, when the sudden overrunning of the sitting regime happened, Assad was very entrenched. The West was clearly in favor of his downfall, but he was backed significantly by Russia and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So his power was entrenched through that external backing. Turkey had turned on his regime and was in favor of regime change as well. And so there was a confluence of forces that really came in and created a situation where this rebel entity led by Ahmed al-Shara could come in and very peacefully take over power. And this was done, we know, through various evidentiary strands. It was done likely through negotiations and through decision-making to back this particular individual who was, identified as someone who was very charismatic and had built relationships with Turkey and Western powers who would be ensuring this transition. And so leading up to this moment, there had been significant work done by Syrian civil society and the opposition at the time, sort of mapping out a roadmap, a blueprint for a transition, which included a very specific transitional justice process, which included judicial accountability, prosecution for high-level ranking officers for Assad and his family, and then truth-telling and reparations, the full scope of transitional justice remedies that help societies get over incidents of autocracy and violence. And they had been moving the judicial accountability project very significantly in the national court, I'm assuming, in Europe and other places, including in the US, which I'm assuming Max spoke to a little bit. And so when this uprooting of Assad happened by a rebel force that was backed by external forces, all these ideas about how transitional justice would unfold in Syria were sort of laid to the side. The incoming authority made statements about holding Assad officials accountable and took some steps in that direction, which signals potential meaningful opportunity. But there was no negotiated settlement. There was no agreement that this is what the transition is going to be based on, that this is the normative regime, that these are the mechanisms for the transition. And so you had this charismatic power come up, within the context of people just being exhausted by 14 years of heavy violence, displacement, destruction, and despair and sanctions that really had left the country without basic standards of living, deeply impoverished. And so there was like this sense of euphoria that embraced this person. But there was no political platform around which to build accountability. And instead what happened are this centralized approach through presidential decree of constitution, presidential decree establishing the legal and institutional framework for transitional justice, presidential decree appointing the commissioners on these mechanisms. And these processes were incomplete and did not fulfill public expectations, nor have they materialized into transitional justice processes in terms of a national rendering. And instead, what authorities have done is sort of pursue a localized national Syrian-led process under a legal regime, which is, harkens back to the autocracy of the Assad dynasty. And so there's not a legal basis to pursue meaningful transitional justice for anyone, let alone the sitting authority. And there's no political leverage to gain the accountability as the sitting government and its allies continue to commit crimes.
Well, that sounds really bad. I mean, that sounds like it's, this sounds like a sort of a dummy transitional justice, which in many ways could be worse than no transitional justice at all. Is that, am I justified in drawing that kind of awful conclusion?
No, I think for me, it's actually the opposite. For me, it's very clear. Syria is still in conflict. You have a wealth of expertise among civil society and, broad international support for a Syria that is, normatively better. So there's a lot of UN resources. There's so much available to actually create a better accountability system. But we have to continue pushing for this notion that we're not in transition yet, and there's still political work that has to be done. Unfortunately, the international community has very much aligned with the Syrian-led approach because the way that the world looks at the Middle East is through a stability lens as opposed to a justice lens.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask a couple. Oh, yeah. Ask a question.
And so I think that there's often this incentive to really rush ahead and do transitional justice. Like that. In some ways, the transitions happened and the time sort of seems right, and there's a fear that the time will be less ripe if we don't act. But I agree with what Layla is saying is you shouldn't just rush ahead just to do something in the moment, but continue to push for making more ideal conditions.
So a couple of more specific questions that you can answer just limited way, or you can expand on it, and all three of you can take them however you want. But one is just following up on Layla's comment on the international dimension of this. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting from the outside, and for all of you current or former prosecutors in the room, is that the idea is that for a long time before the end of 2024, a lot of actors have been working very hard to gather documentary evidence of atrocity crimes in Syria. International NGOs have been doing it. In some cases, private citizens have been doing it. We think of the Caesar photographs. And in one of a sort of a relatively rare win for the UN, actually, the UN, I think, in my view, has done a really exemplary job in many ways in setting up the international independent impartial mechanism for investigation in Syria and the independent investigative commission for missing persons. These are, in some senses, all about documentation. So, and that evidence has to be forensically preserved for the chain of custody and all these sorts of things for an eventual prosecution. Is the interim government, is the National Commission fully coordinated, or are they intending to be fully coordinated with these international mechanisms in terms of best practices for preserving evidence, or is this sort of more aspirational at this point?
I mean, it seems right now that they have announced the founding of it, but we still don't really necessarily have like a document that lays out exactly what its aspirations are. That there have been interviews, with members who are going to be leading it who say that it is hopefully going to be an inclusive process. It's been said that they want to include kind of the work of civil society organizations as kind of part of its work, but I don't think we know yet in terms of where it's going to hold, which is why I feel like this is, as a time frame, is really critical because it gives us the opportunity to kind of advocate and push for what we want out of that government body. So if in many ways, we're seeing that, when they've initially founded it, that it's going to be holding members of the former regime accountable, I think that's why you have a lot of civil society organizations that are now coming out and saying press releases of, no, we want a justice process that holds all violators accountable and that gives space for all victims. And so I think this is kind of a critical part of kind of where we're seeing this body growing is we're kind of waiting to see what happens. It's founding and the members of being appointed have been like a little bit delayed, which I don't think is necessarily surprising. I do think like overlaying all of our conversation is that Syria economically has been devastated over the course of this war. 90% of the population lives below the poverty line. So partly you kind of don't have a lot of funds. So, when we're talking about like, okay, we want this timeline to happen very quickly, there are also bureaucratic and kind of material issues that potentially also might be preventing this that I think we should also keep in mind.
The commissions that were mandated and constituted, they include really prominent members of civil society that were out on the front lines advocating for justice, that were part of the family associations of survivors and victim families of the disappeared. And so they are part of these commissions and represented those voices that are going to pursue meaningful justice, who are networked with these international bodies, the UN mechanisms, and that bring the linkages to the INGOs that were part of the national cases in France and Germany prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there is that sort of infrastructural capacity and seeming intent to enable it. But what has happened is that this centralized governing instinct of the transitional authority under Ahmed al-Shara has really held tight to decision making, and has, the government has met with the heads of the UN entities and has engaged with them and has allowed them some access to the country to do some investigations, but they have not been allowed to be deployed yet. So it's still a question, and we're waiting, and people are waiting. And I guess there's a point in time where it becomes, how do we continue waiting, or do we start looking for something else?
The comment I have is a bit more technical, and so Matt, you raised the issue about evidence gathering that has happened. And one of the things that I observed was that you had lots of different organizations, both transnational as well as domestic, that were doing this. We're doing it in different ways. They each had their own databases, and they had different criteria for the data collection. And so I'm curious about where things stand, or that this was my impression, say, shortly before the pandemic began. And so I'm interested in learning more about what's happened since then, right? Is there still these different kind of fiefdoms, if you will, of data and evidence out there, or has there been some more collaboration that's happened?
At least from our point of view, Syrians for Truth and Justice has its own database of violations, and then there's often collaboration between civil society organizations who might be looking at the same, like similar patterns of violations. So sometimes we find ourselves, co-writing papers or kind of sharing data or like cross-listing kind of things that we're working on. So I think there is collaboration, but it's still, at least from my side, from the civil society front, it's not like there's like one collective database where all of Syrian civil society is kind of putting in all of its evidence. Everyone kind of has their own secure mechanisms for securing the data. I think it was partly because as people were building these databases, there was never a sense of knowing when it was ever going to be used or if it was ever going to be used. So it was very much people collecting this data and doing their best to preserve it and kind of corroborate evidence and trying to like hold on to it and keep it safe for when the time would come. And so I think now we're still in this period of figuring out, all right, we have these databases. When the process starts, how is that potentially going to be used? I don't know if we like
So I mean, there's so much to say about documentation, and there's some really interesting write-ups in the New Yorker about how Syrians, in the context of the civil, in the war and uprising, as territory was liberated from the Assad regime, investigators would roll in and take documentation proving chain of command from the security facilities that the officials had run from. And then that material was smuggled out, like on bodies. Documents, with signatures approving responsibility, photos, and this huge amount of evidence, right? Like, I think, Rebecca, you wrote something on this, and what that if you put all the evidence that's been collected into a video, it would, and it ran consecutively, it would run for 22 years nonstop. And the bravery that went into, gaining this documentation has been immense. And the UN IIIM is a new thing in transitional justice, where it was created to sort of serve as a repository, a central hub for the documentation. And it's been collecting that documentation and centralizing it with civil society support, creating evidence, building cases that enabled, tens of cases to be brought under universal jurisdiction for war crimes, crimes against humanity, against, relatively high-ranking officers in France and Germany and Sweden and in the US. And so this documentation is available now, but when the regime left, more documents became available. But those documents have yet to be centralized. One civil society organization has 1 million documents in its possession. But even putting that new evidence aside, there has been enough evidence for France to issue arrest warrants against Assad. There is evidence out there. There is chain of command established, but what there isn't is the legal provisions in Syria to allow for prosecuting international crimes.
I would just thank you. That's really. I would just add that this is something that you probably thought about too. That a lot of this documentary evidence for this kind of context now occurs in the age of the smartphone, when everybody's a videographer. And what that is, including perpetrators who, as you indicated, are extraordinarily fond of recording and uploading their own perpetrations. So one of the things that's so fascinating about working in this field these days is that there can be a surf hit, there can be a tsunami of visual evidence, of recorded evidence. And the question isn't like, how do we document these crimes? The question is, how do we possibly, A, vet and authenticate the content of these videos, of this documentation, but B, and I wondered if you even run into any of this, how do we protect the uploaded cloud-based documentation from being hacked and tampered with just enough to interrupt the chain of custody, to make that inadmissible in any prosecution? Because that's been happening a lot with a lot of international NGOs that have done documentary work in the Syrian context.
From our front, it was kind of the sense of the database was very much controlled by like 1 or 2 people who had logins. Like, no one else can access it because security was a main problem. A lot of the kind of infrastructure goes about kind of controlling it. Partly we're building out the database, and then you also just say you hear a story on the ground, like a field researcher hears about a violation, and then they collect something. We can't just take that one story and then like submit it to something like IIIM, or you can't, like write a report on that. So what you do is you collect that story, and then you keep doing research, and then you find another piece of corroborating evidence, so then that goes into kind of the bucket, and then you find another piece of corroborating evidence, and so you kind of build it out to the sense that you are then maybe able to share it, report on it, document on it. But so because of that, like the database is kind of full of kind of stories which are slowly being built out and violations that are kind of being corroborated with evidence that we end up then getting to use to kind of report on patterns, which hopefully will be beneficial to international bodies.
Okay, now I have another question for you. So, and this next question is really, I'm going to preface it with a plug. Very shortly after the fall of the Assad regime, sort of roughly a year ago, we here at GMAP had a webinar talking about the prospects for transitional justice in Syria in the very early days. And when we were putting together the lineup, we ended up with 5 diasporic Syrian activists, human rights people, and David's former boss, Beth Banchak, who is among many other hats she wears as a Syria expert. She is the last, for the time being, ambassador for global criminal justice at the State Department. It was a great webinar. It was really informative. You had 6 people in the room and about 17 different opinions on the same matters. It was a very spirited and very, very intense debate. If you would like to watch it, you can by just going to the IGMET website and going on the webinars link, and you can watch it. The reason I bring this up, apart from the shameless plug that I just did, is that it was at that time not possible to have any participation from Syria. So the entire lineup of this webinar was Syrians in the diaspora. People zooming in from Doha, from Brussels, from France, from Canada, from Berlin. So, I mean, you're in the two of you are in a sort of an odd position to comment on this, but I want to ask the question of you anyway. There's clearly a certain kind of, and I want to get Eric in because I think Eric can speak to this in sort of comparative sense. There's a really fascinating and both a practically and even a morally complex issue about the role of the Syrian diaspora in the role that they can or should play in the broader sense of rebuilding the country, but in the more precise sense of bringing justice and accountability to perpetrators. And I've read, I guess, I've heard some pretty interesting and pretty tough conversations about what the standing of the diasporic experts is. Do they stay in the comfortable home? Not comfortable. Do they stay in the homes that they've made for themselves as refugees for the past, however many years? Do they have an obligation to return home? Are they authorized to participate if they remain diasporic? I don't know what my question is exactly, except to say I've been struck by this is not the first time that people have faced this problem. And so I wanted to ask you two if you could reflect on it a little bit from your positionality. And maybe I ask Eric a certain kind of comparativist question.
So I think the diaspora, the Syrian diaspora they're very nationalistic, right? And the uprising in 2011 was very genuine. And people really risked a lot and saw their families and colleagues being disappeared, up to 200,000 maybe were forcibly disappeared through arbitrary arrest and torture, and 150,000 continue to be missing. So there's a lot of nationalism, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of in the diaspora people really organized to work on Syria. So there wasn't this sense of we're going into the diaspora in order to become different people. There was a sense of we are going to work from the diaspora to support our people who are inside and, bring accountability, regime change, and produce this great human rights, rule of law state where we're going to enjoy freedom. And so, when this, and also you had this dynamic where the uprising became armed quite early on by the Free Syrian Army before the fighting became turned into sectarian dimensions and Al-Qaeda got involved and ISIS appeared. And so when this new entity, the Ahmed al-Shara's people came, they were armed. There was a sense of affinity with these armed actors. And there was a lot of this euphoria at this, amazing change that happened relatively peacefully. And so there was really, major mobilization. Everyone moved their operations, their convenings, their advocacy from the diaspora to inside Syria. But that space has slowly been more constrained. The civil society law, registration law, the principles that governed the civic space under Assad has been retained. And so, for instance, people have to register with the government authorities. And that there are maybe 1,500 organizations that have been able to register and operate relatively openly, but then there are others that haven't been able to register. Those that have been able to register have over time maybe evidenced a little bit of willingness to signal compromise and generosity than those that are unable to operate openly. And so people are maneuvering in the space, and there's a lot that hinges on just the general internal politics and legal regime that's going to be adopted and pursued internally, and then what happens regionally in the security context now. So there's a lot of variables that are impacting the ability of the diaspora to really mobilize, and so far they've hung on, and there is presence in the country that is important, but it needs to advance more quickly.
The more we're talking about this, the more it reminds me of what Gesson was talking about in their speech last night about how overdetermined is that choice of where to be.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that the diaspora is not a monolith. I mean, there are members of the diaspora like me who I never had to flee Syria. I was never a refugee. I was born in the US. And so I still consider myself as part of kind of a Syrian American diaspora that kind of became a part of kind of this mobilization for Syria as it happened. And then there are also many Syrians who were very much in exile, right? Much of Syrians for Truth and Justice are people who had been arbitrarily detained, many of whom experienced torture and government prisons, who then ended up leaving, because it was to save their lives in many ways. And they have been able to kind of work very closely with Syrians on the ground to continue doing the kind of work. And so I think that kind of collaboration was really important for being able to kind of take a lot of the stories that people were saying on the ground in Syria and being able to then bring it out into kind of an international conversation. That being said, I think it's been interesting hearing from many different Syrian civil society, these kind of debates over do we go back? If we go back, is it going to influence the way that we do our reporting? Are we gonna have to play more politics? And I think, for many people, there is some kind of concern of, well, we don't want to get rid of the integrity of what we do, which is, at least from SDJ's point of view, has been to try and be honest and to speak openly about violators from all sides, whether or not they're affiliated with the interim government or not. And so there's some kind of concern about, okay, I think people are still trying to put feelers out of what's it going to look like if we're work on the ground and we register. And I think, unfortunately, it seems that the interim government does want to continue applying this associations law that had been in place. And the issue with that associations law is it can be, if you look at its amendments, it can be pretty arbitrary what kind of associations are allowed to function and when they can be closed down. And there hasn't really been a sense of, is the interim government planning on, is it going to be accepting all of these amendments? Because some of them say that associations can just be closed, if the government feels like they're not doing their job, or if potentially they're affecting moral or faith character. So things like that can potentially cause some anxiety among organizations of, all right, what's the metric that's going to allow us to function?
There are some interesting dynamics here that are worth elaborating and thinking about other cases. So one that comes to mind is in Haiti after Aristide was returned to power in the mid-1990s. There was a truth commission that was largely driven by diaspora activists, which in some circles it sort of discredited it because they've been outside. I think talking about diasporas is important in other ways too, in ways that have parallels to Syria. One example that comes to mind to me is Sri Lanka, where Tamils in the diaspora after the civil war ended, continued to put pressure on largely the governments of the countries in which they were living by demonstrating and continuing to put pressure so that their governments were putting pressure through the UN Human Rights Council and other venues. So I think diasporas can also play that role, and that might be well suited in a context like Syria, where you really have a clear victor in the conflict. At least that's what it seems to be. But it was Syria at the moment. One of the things we've in talking so far and talking about diasporas and about mobilization, well, diasporas in particular, is that we've been talking about diasporas are at the elite level, right? The transitional justice experts, but we should also be thinking about those Syrians who are refugees, right? And what do they think? And all of our hour-long conversation has largely implicitly been focused on criminal accountability, and rightly so. Right? But there are lots of different issues, lots of different forms of justice, right, that may resonate more with others in the diaspora. And this is sort of going to lead me to ask a question. Zaina and Layla have anything to add on this? And one of the things that seemed very problematic and challenging for me was so in the late 2010s, the Assad regime was there were these laws promulgated around property, and essentially the regime was threatening, if for those who had left the country or were internally displaced, if you didn't go back to your property by a certain amount of time, then the government could compensate it or confiscate it. So the law was promulgated, but then I was unable to continue to follow. But for a long time, it was not enforced. And it was sort of like a sort of Damocles over people in the diaspora. So I think when we're talking about this is also sort of an invitation that I want to know more about what's happened with land, and I know that there's also roughly, from what data I've seen, roughly half of property in Syria there's not formal land title for this, so there's all these complications there. But more generally, just to draw attention to non-criminal accountability as an important part of the conversation.
I mean, HLP violations are one of the primary things we would document on at STJ, because arbitrary arrest and detention and torture are kind of violations we talk about a lot, but also HLP violations really end up creating not only problems for the people who are coming in, but also divisions among the community. Because you'll have houses that, ended up being confiscated by some armed group or another, and then maybe that person sold the house, to someone else who doesn't know that the house had been originally seized. And then you have the original, people who had owned the house have their original documentation. And so then you kind of just have these layers of who gets to be able to control certain housing, who gets justified. Like it's such a knot and a tangle that I think we still haven't figured out how they're going to do it. Because it can't just be a blanket statement of, oh, everyone who has, houses that were, had not been seized or who had fled the country and have their land titles, they're able to come back and claim their homes. Like there's been a push for that. But then there also has to be some question of like, what about the people who maybe did not know and then had thought that they were buying property themselves? Like, do they get compensation? So I guess what that is to say is I don't have an answer to how complicated that question will be, only that it's not only causing problems for people who are returning, but it's also creating a lot of tensions in communities who, unfortunately, like not only over these last few years of war, but throughout the entire reign of the Assad regime, has been working a lot in kind of breaking these boundaries of connections between communities that I think we've talked a lot about as being really important even yesterday in our conversation. And this is just one example of ways in which, neighbors can ultimately like turn on one another because there's really serious questions of, do I get to return back to my house? Can my neighbor return back to my house? Like, what is this, stranger doing living in my neighborhood?
I would just pick up a little bit on this question of diaspora, the leads, the tensions. What's their role? What's the diaspora's role in, it's not the new Syria, but in the change. I think maybe it's an over-dramatized tension, because there's always tension within any society generally, but then, you overlay that with a lot of grievance, right? And Syria, like many countries, their grievances are legacy. They go, that date back far before Assad, right? And then there's all this colonialism and all of these dimensions that feed into a situation where tensions manifest in ways that people don't even really, they can't even put words to them. It's very complex right now also because of the misinformation and the incitement and the lack of a comprehensive narrative coming from, Damascus about inclusion and justice and, let alone, okay, that narrative is missing, but, it's not backed by real action. So I think in that context, the diaspora can sometimes be a weaponized concept. And so I think we have to be careful about that and really sort of appreciate what the elite brings, because in Syria's, transitional justice project, there has never been a lack of engagement at, the local level, and there's never really been an unwillingness to not be adaptive to restorative processes or other forms of non-prosecutorial justice through dialogue and reconciliation at the local level.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
I agree with both of these comments, and that is, given the circumstances at the national level, the government's lack of interest or lack thereof, and also just the recognition that the issues do vary in different parts of the country. So I would love to hear more. I want to talk about how more local or regional kind of initiatives are happening or are being discussed anyway.
I can maybe answer this just from like my own personal experience more than I can necessarily from like STJs, but I can say that, communities do try and help each other a lot, especially in the rebuilding process. I mean, my family is initially from Raqqa, and much of their neighborhood and much of the city was destroyed by the international coalition airstrikes to fight against Daesh. And so when people came back to their communities, they found neighborhoods basically entirely decimated, like there were no buildings left standing. And over time, neighbors have just slowly been helping each other rebuild their houses, right? Like people took iron from their families' gravestones to help people like create window shutters. So like there is like a lot of local work on the ground that like I think that especially Syrians are so adept at being able to kind of work together and to slowly create community amongst themselves. And I think that is in spite of, like Layla had mentioned, generations of people attempting to kind of sow, friction between communities. So in terms of like local on the ground, there's a lot of like local, initiatives that happen, like even on our neighborhood in Damascus, for a lot of time, there had been no kind of water that was coming into the country, largely because, Israel took control of some major dams. But like, because of that, Damascus was having a bit of a water crisis. So it became a kind of a thing, even when I was there in Damascus, where people would have kind of barrels of water on the top of their ceilings. And if their neighbor runs out of water, they like have like a hose that they like run from their, their tank, and then they run it downstairs and they send it into a truck, and then they take it to their neighbor's house across the street. So there is, these kind of like local things on the ground that people are trying to do. And I think the hope is if people are given the space and the money to be able to do that, that they're going to be able to kind of start more of these. Yeah.
All right, let's turn to the question. I would love to do like a quick lightning round of you get one wish. I mean, it's been a year of transitional justice in Syria. There's a lot to do and it hasn't been long. And so before we go to questions, just a super lightning round, you have like 30 seconds. And so here's the setup, I'm putting you on the spot. You have been granted by the transitional justice gods one wish to change the policy posture, the policy priorities, both of the interim government and of the National Commission. And whatever you tell them to do, they'll do for 2020, for the next year. And so what's your wish? We'll start with Layla.
I would tell them to refocus their priorities from the external to the internal and convene a dialogue, meaningful dialogue.
To me, vetting of the armed forces seems an important thing, important priority.
Yeah, I think for me, it would be making sure the justice process accounts for all victims, not necessarily because, we want to rank certain violators as kind of having committed more violations than another, but mainly because we don't want to create a hierarchy of victims. Like we want all victims, regardless what violations that they had experienced, whoever's hands, to feel like they can be a meaningful part of the transitional justice process.
Thank you very much. The floor is open.
We're going to start with Karen.
Do you want me to do that?
Thanks so much. This has been really interesting. I have two really quick questions. One is we often talk about sequencing when it comes to transitional justice and determining which goals are both desirable and most feasible at different moments when it comes to pursuing truth, justice, reparations, and reform. I'm wondering, what does it seem like as far as that, like what goals are civil society and governmental actors seeing as most feasible to pursue first, and which do they feel can be sort of delayed? And the second is, oftentimes these TJ initiatives are funded also by donor states in the global north. Thank you, Max. And they then have some sort of, say in what these processes look like. So I'm wondering, where is the money coming from, and how is that potentially going to impact what these processes look like?
Thank you. The inside joke is I tend to ask 15-minute questions. And so I count on Carrie to make the secret gesture to tell me to really stop talking. So yeah, please.
I mean, I can just say that I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of donor states that are involved in the process. I wonder if part of the decision to try and attempt to make the transitional process in-house in Syria, like within the government, I wonder how much that might be because they're kind of concerned about, what happens if we get money from outside. But at the same time, in terms of civil society right now, it's kind of hard to be able to say what is your priority? Because it feels like everyone, if you ask anyone, at any different civil society level, everyone's gonna have a different priority. But I think the main ones is we wanna create, like I remember hearing this one statement by this Palestinian priest that's always stayed with me, which is, in order to have peace, you need to have truth, justice, and then peace. And it has to go in that kind of sequence. And I think we're very much in the stage where people are like, okay, let's start with the truth part, right? Like, let's be able to put everything out on the table and be able to do that first. And then collectively together, we can think about justice, and then hopefully we can make our way towards the ultimate goal. I don't know, Layla, if you have any specifics.
I think the money there's so much money going into the justice piece that seemed to check very well because it was directed towards civil society and building evidence and movements in a way that feels right. So I think money now is just drying up. Everywhere, including for Syria. I think the issue is more what is the political posture that is being adopted? And that is going to be what's most distorting here, because there's just, again, it's through the stability lens, it's just, well, whatever is going to keep the situation calm, keep the regional players happy, keep Israel at bay, keep, Turkey, whatever, so. And that in the process means that all of these actors that have been mobilizing for justice and accountability for so long are being left on the sidelines while, this Syria-led process is being endorsed without payoff for change on the ground. So I think the political posturing and diplomacy is very important. And then in terms of sequencing, I was very interested in the discussion yesterday about restorative justice, because I think it's most meaningful to build up, and horizontally, and people need different things. Justice, prosecution, I don't think it only provides limited satisfaction, but what we've seen in the Syria context is that when prosecution of the high-ranking officials, like Assad, has asylum in Moscow, not pursuing just prosecution for him, for instance, is causing a lot of problems inside, a lot of tensions. And so I think sequencing may be that we do some level of prosecution, some level of accountability for those high-ranking officials, and then do a broader transitional justice process once the political conditions enable a comprehensive approach.
Just quickly comment on the sequencing question. And that's also to come back to, the observation that was made earlier about how, in the Syrian context, right, we could focus on atrocities during the civil war. We could focus on violations under the Assad regime prior to 2011, things that have happened since the overthrow of the regime. And I think there's this tendency to want to try to seize the moment and try to do everything at the moment, but maybe there are some things that might be, some chunks of that history that might be easier to deal with sooner rather than later. And I see this with some racial justice activists in the US that see that's less controversial. Like, let's start with pre-civil rights, like lynching episodes, for example. That might be less challenging to deal with than some more contemporary harms.
My question is about the use of chemical weapons during the war and the prosecution of those crimes. So, Leila, you mentioned universal jurisdiction. There's currently a war crimes trial happening in France. I'm not aware of any other such efforts elsewhere. So I'm curious, what is the state of the evidence that is available in the prosecution of these trials, and then particularly at the level of individuals that were exposed, rather than just de-identified aggregate data.
Thank you. Go one by one?
No, go for it.
I can't I know there are people in the audience that have more expertise on this question than I do. There was a French arrest warrant issued for Assad for complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity for a chemical war attack in Damascus suburbs. There have been 213 chemical attacks. That arrest warrant was subsequently overturned on appeal because it happened when the government was in power, and so immunity struck that out. But there have been other steps taken by the UN chemical entity that, you know, so this is a process that's ongoing, but I can't really speak to the specifics about the quality or quantity of data availability per victim. But I know it's a very deeply held, important issue for the people that have experience.
Could we crowdsource that all? Does anybody else know any more about this? No. Who's next?
Thank you. You mentioned a little bit earlier about the complexity of the conflict, of course. It involves a lot of communities and it varies by region, sub-region, et cetera. Could you say something about whether the Alawite and Druze communities have been involved in the transitional justice process? And are there particular actors or groups that have been actively involved in supporting this? And if so, how? What that looks like. Thank you.
I mean, right now, there had been deals made after the Assad regime fell to be able to give kind of members who are former parts of the government to basically sign these reconciliation agreements, you know, with the government. However, I think there's currently a lot of tension and frustration within communities, partly because of the massacres that happened, because it feels like, you know, a lot of the violators who committed those massacres haven't been held accountable, or at least the accountability processes have been very slow. Like right now in Sweden, for example, like the interim government doesn't have control over Sweden. You know, it's Druze armed groups that have control there. And so partly, you know, like the lack of accountability or kind of like willingness to kind of hold violators to account quickly or to kind of put factions in check, I think is kind of creating more kind of divisions between those communities. We've also done kind of a lot of reporting recently about the fact that a lot of Alawis recently have been reporting violations that they don't feel like when they're going to kind of the police or the security forces, that those violations are being taken seriously. So notably, we've been reporting on certain cases of a lot of ransom of Alawi women. So they get kidnapped and then they get held for ransom. Many of them experience sexual violence. And at least it seems from the posture of the interim government has been that like those cases are not real. And that they're not necessarily valid. And I mean, we reported on them. Commission of Inquiry has said something about it. There's recently been a New York Times piece that you might be able to see that kind of was published last week. And so I think that's kind of creating some tension. In terms of the Kurdish groups like the SDF, there has been, you know, like a peace treaty signed, but whether that treaty is going to hold, I think remains to be seen.
I'm interested to hear more about environmental recovery, and if there's any conversations as such, what are their priorities?
I think, you know, so Syria's, the whole Middle East, right, is the front line of climate change, right? So there's major drought that's happening in the country, and the staple food is bread, and wheat is being exported, I think, right, and then or imported, and now what they're really trying to work on is enabling agricultural production of wheat internally to make Syria more self-sufficient. And I think that there's been some interesting movements in that regard. There are different levels of different areas of ministerial work where some thoughtful technical processes are able to be pursued, and the agricultural realm is one of them. There have, one of the tactics of war that was implemented across Syria and the agricultural areas was undermining or plugging up the water systems, undermining, destroying agricultural infrastructure, which we see in many contexts. And so there's been an effort to raise up the need to repair those damages as a matter of justice. But these sorts of creative reparatory approaches have really fallen by the wayside because there's not a lot of money and it's not been lifted up as a high priority nationally because it's less visible, more individualized. But it's important issue.
Thank you. Recognizing that the international community is deeply dysfunctional right now, I was curious what sorts of engagement in terms of pressure and incentives and carrots and sticks would be most helpful to help push the interim government. To Leila's comment, I do think there's often the sense of stability is the most important, and we don't want to push this government too far because it's a better outcome. But how far should we be pushing this government, and what do you think would be most useful?
I will say one thing that the international community could do and pressure, not necessarily only on the interim government, but maybe some pressure on Israel to be able to kind of withdraw from Syrian territory. Because that, if we're talking about like issues towards stability, that is one place where the international community could really put a foot down. In terms of for like the interim government, I do think, this is also me personally speaking, like this is not STJ, I want to separate that out. I sometimes think sanctions get overused when we're talking about, how we're going to hold governments accountable. And I think sometimes right now, Syria needs pressure and dialogue. And it seems like there are, pressure is working in some respect. Like recently there had been a law that was supposed to be passed in Damascus where they were going to ban alcohol in certain areas. And there were a lot of protests that happened on the streets and the government walked back that law. So like that's, a good sign of there's some kind of, like they're listening a little bit. So I think on that front, that is kind of helpful, but I don't know if someone else wants to challenge me on the sanctions point.
I agree with you. Sanctions don't work. I've had students do research on it.
Yeah, my question was partly answered because I was worried most of the perpetrators were carried out by people from the Alawite community when Assad was in power, and now that community might feel directly persecuted when they are seeing almost everyone who is held accountable is coming from there. And so how is it possible to balance both that feeling of we are now being persecuted and also getting accountability for the crimes committed?
No victor's justice.
Well, I think, Alawite, the majority of Syrians were against this regime, right? Nobody really enjoyed freedom. And that Alawite community was mobilized and used to protect and enable the totalitarian regime that they also suffered under. So I think that victor's justice is more historical, and the reordering of relationships needs to be historically narrated, right? Because the Alawi have traditionally been, poor farming communities, and the Sunnis were aristocratic that enslaved or utilized and exploited Alawi labor. And then under French colonialism, the Alawi were the minority that was backed and their totalitarian regime was enabled and Assad came to power, but then you also had Arab nationalism, which, they built on, and then the Israeli, the axis of resistance fed into it. I mean, there's so many layers of complications in these contexts. It's not simply Alawite versus Sunni, but it's a dimension that needs to be, it needs to be told, but in a historical context. And I think the space isn't there to do a broader narrating of the social tensions that exist within Syria. But at the surface level, there's been a lot of directed crimes going on at the Alawi community, which is creating more barriers to this kind of historical healing and helping it. So.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take 3 very, very concise questions, please.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I would like to hear about the progress of identifying people from the mass graves. I know that the International Commission on Missing Persons has been playing a very good role there. I'm very familiar with that process, given what happened in Bosnia, and that's where the commission began.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question ties into the previous one. I wanted to ask about commemoration practices from survivor communities, the role of memorialization, because it's also part of transnational justice. And you spoke more about documentation and going to court and everything like this. But to gain recognition, we know that commemoration is super important, and also learning the victims. So yeah, I wanted to ask about that, like from the ground, if survivors are marking the mass graves and so on, and what from the governmental side is being done, or if it's like shut away, and if there's a public discourse about it. Thank you.
Thank you. My question ties into that also, because you've spoken about documentation. So I was wondering the prevention aspect, if there's any plan, especially from STJ, not just to document, also to use these documentations, these materials for future prevention, because we all know that one of the things that is common about countries that have gone through mass atrocities is the recurrence. So are there plans to use these documentations or this research for future prevention? Thank you.
Squeeze one last question in, and then you can take a swing at any of them you want, but they have to stay and answer your questions during the coffee break too. They don't have to, they probably will.
Thank you. I'm Harama from University of Slimani. There was talk about NGOs and civil society in Syria. You know how important the Kurds have been in the war against ISIS and Bashar Assad. But it was just 3 or 4 months ago that the Syrian Arab forces attacked the Kurdish area and wanted to take a control of the Kurdish area at any cost. Even though these are the Kurds, these areas are Kurds, and the Kurds have been in control of them for 10 years after the Arab Spring. But if it weren't from support for the US, France, Italy, allies, forces, the efforts of senators like Lindsey Graham, the demonstrations of the Kurds around the world, especially the Kurds of the diaspora, and the role of the head of the Kurdistan Regional Government, this would have happened, and the genocide of the Kurds would be inevitable. As happened in Aleppo, where they destroyed 2 Kurdish neighborhoods and expelled more than 100,000 Kurds from their city. We didn't see any reaction from the NGOs and civil society in this area?
And you have 10 seconds each to respond.
I mean, I can say that, so Syrians for Truth and Justice, we record much of our violations within Kurdish majority areas. So we recently, actually yesterday, published a report on the attacks on the neighborhoods in Aleppo. And I think I potentially will, kind of go back to my constant line, but I feel like the ability to be able to move forward, to think about commemoration, about prevention, I think it starts from that and we've said this throughout this conference, of a victim-centered approach where all victims of violations, whoever perpetrates the violation, whether or not they're interim government, whether or not they're Assad regime, whether or not they're from any different group, every victim gets kind of a privilege to be able to speak about the violations that they have experienced, and every perpetrator should be held accountable to the same level. And if we create that kind of equitability, that can create kind of more ability to have open conversations and transitional justice processes.
I just would say that everything that everyone's raised is super important, and we can talk about it for a long time. The mass graves, the memorialization, the Kurdish frontline. I mean, it's a major problem.
All right, we are at time, and so we didn't get to really address in much depth the last questions, but as I said, I'm sure if you followed them during the coffee break. Please join me in thanking the panelists.